Greetings, my dear viewer. You're on the channel The Price of Cheating. The channel is for those who appreciate traditional family values and condemn adultery. So be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. Rachel Thomas found herself perched on an unfamiliar chair, her eyes darting uneasily around the space. Just moments ago, she had been in the bedroom she shared with her husband, Reggie, a man she'd been married to for 5 years. The transition baffled her. She couldn't piece together what she had been doing right before arriving in this strange place. One moment she was there, and in the blink of an eye, she was here. How could this have happened? Her gaze swept over the room. There were no windows, and she couldn't make out a door. Despite the absence of any visible light source, the room was brilliantly illuminated with an all-encompassing white glow. The walls, the ceiling, and even the floor were cloaked in this relentless whiteness, as though the entire space had been swallowed by light. Her attire blended seamlessly with her surroundings, a plain white robe that matched the stark chair she was seated on and the spotless table in front of her. Strangely, the intense light produced no shadows. The air felt oppressive, and she could feel perspiration forming on her forehead. She wiped it away using the sleeve of her robe. Then, without warning, a door she hadn't noticed swung open. A tall, slender man stepped in, dressed impeccably in a pristine white suit. He strode confidently toward the table and sat across from her. Without looking directly at her, he opened a folder he carried and spread it out in front of him. After scanning its contents briefly, his eyes lifted to meet hers. His gaze lingered on her bare legs, her flowing blonde hair, and the gentle curves beneath her robe. Her beauty was undeniable. In another time or place, he thought to himself, he might have allowed himself to be captivated by her charm. What a shame, he mused. Rachel Thomas, he finally said, his voice steady but unnervingly sharp. That's your name, isn't it? She nodded, her hesitation evident. Please respond aloud, he instructed. A simple yes or no will do. Yes, she answered. I'm Rachel Thomas. Can you tell me where I am? What's going on? A faint, rehearsed smile crossed his lips. You truly have no idea, do you? He asked, his tone carrying the fatigue of someone who had posed this question countless times before. No, she said firmly, shaking her head. I really don't. That's not unusual, he said with a nod. It'll all make sense soon enough. It's unbearably warm in here, she said, shifting in her seat. Can I get some ice water or anything at all? The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Funny, I find it a bit on the cool side myself. And no, refreshments aren't part of the service here. If they were, I'm sure we'd have a never-ending queue of people begging for relief. He smirked at his own remark before continuing. Let's focus on the reason you're here, he said, sitting upright. You've been quite the troublemaker, haven't you? I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned in, his expression hardening. Spare me the apologies. They're far too late, and besides, they mean nothing here. They can't change what's already done. Please, she implored, her voice trembling. Don't judge me too harshly. I know I've made mistakes, but I've genuinely tried to be a good person. Judgment isn't my responsibility, he said curtly. That's already been dealt with. My task is simpler. I determine your placement. Now let's proceed. With that, the blank wall behind him flickered to life, transforming into an enormous screen that began to play scenes from her past as though it were a movie. As a child, you were a constant source of frustration for your parents, he narrated, the screen showing a younger version of her defying rules and lying. And when you were 12, you stole a small trinket from a local shop during a trip with your mother. Does that ring a bell? Yes, she admitted quietly. I didn't think anyone noticed. They always think that, he replied with a knowing grin. But let's keep going. By the time you entered college, you'd terminated 3 pregnancies. The last was so poorly performed that it left you unable to conceive. You were, just shy of 19? Her face went pale. I never told my husband, she said softly, her voice heavy with guilt. Early in their marriage, she had fabricated a story about a medical condition that left her infertile. Reggie had believed her without hesitation. The man's expression darkened as he cut her off. That name doesn't belong here, he said sharply. Don't mention it again. Understood? She nodded hastily. Yes, I understand. He returned his focus to the folder, his tone neutral once more. By the time you finished high school, you'd slept with nearly every boy in your grade. The only reason you avoided legal trouble was that you were of age. And the only reason you graduated was because you struck a deal with your English teacher. The memory resurfaced with a sting. Her grades had been abysmal due to her relentless partying, and in desperation, she had propositioned Mr. Ross for a passing grade. He had agreed, and she'd earned a B in his class. In college, the man continued, you built quite the reputation for yourself, wild parties, drugs, and all manner of debauchery. It's honestly a wonder you managed to earn a degree. That's when you met Reginald Thomas. Her heart sank as she recalled their first meeting. Reggie had been a beacon of hope, a chance to leave her past behind. He was charming, ambitious, and loved her deeply. After months of dating, he proposed, and she had eagerly accepted. But monogamy never came naturally to you, did it? The man said, his words cutting. At your bachelorette party, you didn't just flirt with temptation, you indulged it. Every single male stripper, 3 at once to be exact. And yet it was days before you consummated your marriage with your husband. The screen replayed the scene, and her face burned with shame. Yes, she whispered, barely able to speak. Shame serves no purpose now, he said flatly. What's done cannot be undone. He flipped another page in the folder, and the images shifted again. On your wedding day, he began, you managed to slip away for a brief encounter with the best man just moments before walking down the aisle. The memory of that day clung to her, a stain she could never erase. Just a little, she murmured under her breath, the words barely audible. He was your husband's closest friend, wasn't he? The man's voice cut through the silence. Yes, she replied, her voice subdued. He was. And poor Reggie? He never found out, did he? He pressed further. Rachel shook her head slowly. No, he never knew, she admitted quietly. You remained loyal to him during the honeymoon, but that didn't last long, did it? The man continued, his tone sharp. Once you started that job as a legal secretary, it wasn't long before you began toying with the men at work. Over a few months, you slept with several of them. Some even visited your home while Reggie was away on business trips. Isn't that true? Yes, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. You betrayed him, didn't you? He prodded, unrelenting. He never suspected a thing, she replied. He thought I missed him while he was gone. He believed it made me hungry when he returned. He never guessed the truth. Of course he didn't, the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. That poor fool adored you, trusted you completely. Meanwhile, you took pleasure in the power you held over him. You could tell him anything and he'd accept it, wouldn't he? Rachel hesitated. I think so, she finally confessed. He was right, and deep down she knew it. She had often laughed to herself, reveling in her ability to deceive him so effortlessly. During their marriage, she had convinced herself she was untouchable. But you despised him, didn't you? The man accused, his tone cutting deep. He worked tirelessly to provide for both of you while you chased after anyone who caught your fancy. I didn't hate him, she protested, her voice tinged with desperation. I loved him, just not in the same way. Don't lie, he snapped. We know your thoughts, every single one. You didn't respect him. To you, he was weak, nothing compared to the men you pursued, men with power, wealth, excitement. He was just a placeholder, wasn't he? A convenient stopgap until someone better came along. His words left no room for denial. Isn't that the truth? He demanded. Don't waste your breath lying. We already know. Yes, she admitted, her voice cracking. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the weight of her actions bore down on her, suffocating her with their reality. Enough with the tears, he said coldly. Regret is useless now. Can't I have another chance? She pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. Please, I'll make it up to him, I swear. The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Spare me your promises. This isn't some second-rate drama. You had more chances than you ever deserved, and you squandered every one of them. In a last-ditch effort, Rachel tugged at her robe, exposing herself. I know what men want, she stammered, trembling. Let me prove it. His laughter deepened, echoing with cruel amusement. "You think that will work here?" he mocked. "Go ahead, give it a shot." Tentatively, she reached out to touch him. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, she recoiled in agony. Red welts rose where her hands had brushed him as though burned by acid. "What's wrong?" he sneered. "Too hot to handle?" His laughter reverberated through the room, filling her with dread. Rachel collapsed, trembling, her defeat absolute. For the first time, she felt powerless, unable to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Her eyes wandered to the wall, where scenes from her past began to play out. Each moment was more damning than the last. There was the Christmas party at her office, where she had slipped a sedative into Reggie's drink. While he slept soundly in a quiet corner, she had disappeared with 3 co-workers. They had used one of the designated restrooms, and when it was over, she had nonchalantly returned to the party, waking Reggie and driving him home. The next day, she had laughed about the escapade with her colleagues. "You were cruel to him, weren't you?" The man's voice broke through her shame. She felt the crushing weight of the truth. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you know how he finally uncovered your lies?" he asked, his tone unyielding. Rachel shook her head. "No," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He caught a disease," the man explained bluntly. "One you gave him. When he went to the doctor, the test results didn't just reveal the illness, they revealed you. He came home early that day, ready to confront you. Imagine his shock when he walked in and found you with your lover, in his bed." Rachel's mind reeled, but she couldn't recall the details. "I don't remember," she said faintly. "Don't worry," he said. "Let me refresh your memory." The wall shifted, displaying the final moments of her life. In the scene, she was in the bedroom, naked and entangled with her co-worker, Jake. Reggie had entered silently, gun in hand. She hadn't noticed him until she looked up, only to see the barrel aimed at her. Without hesitation, Reggie fired. The flash of the muzzle and the deafening sound filled the room. The bullet tore through her skull, ending her life instantly. The second shot struck Jake in the groin, his scream echoing faintly in the distance. Rachel stared at the replay, shaking uncontrollably. "This can't be real," she sobbed. "Please tell me it's not real." "Oh, it's very real," the man said, his voice devoid of sympathy. She crumpled, her sobs turning into wails. "Then that means I'm dead," she whispered, her words drowned in despair. "This can't be happening." "Oh, it's happening," he replied with chilling finality. It was all unraveling before her eyes. "What about Jake and my husband?" she asked, her voice quivering with unease. The man sitting across from her reclined in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips, tinged with derision. "Funny time to start worrying about them now, isn't it?" he replied with a mocking tone. "But since you're so curious, I'll indulge you. Your lover's in the hospital. He'll live, though he's lost more than just his pride. Let's say fatherhood won't be in his future. Honestly, that might be a blessing for everyone involved." Her body went rigid as a cold dread coiled in her chest. "And my husband?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The man let out a theatrical sigh and shook his head, feigning pity. "Your husband, after realizing the disaster he'd caused, turned the gun on himself. He didn't succeed, though. The bullet missed his brain but left his face a mangled ruin. He's in surgery as we speak. Once he recovers, they'll likely send him to a psychiatric institution for a few years. Eventually, he'll move on. Without you, naturally." Her voice dropped further. "Will I ever see him again?" "No," he said curtly. Before he pulled the trigger, he asked for forgiveness. You know, from upstairs. He waved a hand lazily toward the ceiling. "They're really into that sort of thing up there. Fits the brand." Her stomach churned with fury. "So he kills me? And he gets away with it?" The man raised an eyebrow and gave a casual shrug. "I wouldn't call it getting away with it. There will be an investigation, legal proceedings, the whole song and dance. But with a competent lawyer, it'll be written off as temporary insanity. People tend to be pretty sympathetic toward someone who tries to end their own life. Let's be real, Anyone going to those lengths isn't exactly sound of mind. He leaned forward, his amusement evident. He'll spend some time in a psych ward and then rebuild what's left of his life. You, on the other hand, don't get that kind of second chance. Her breath hitched. "What happens to me?" she asked, her words trembling with terror. The man's smirk widened. "We're not in the business of granting wishes here, so forget whatever fantasy you have about eternal peace and fluffy clouds. But don't worry, we've got a nice spot reserved for you. It's cozy, a little toasty, sure, but you'll get used to it. Maybe." Her eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, he reached for a button on the table. The floor beneath her gave way with a sudden jolt. Her chair disappeared, and with it, her robe. She was left standing, exposed and defenseless, while the man regarded her with an unsettling satisfaction. A foul stench hit her nostrils, sharp and sulphurous, like decaying eggs. From the abyss below rose agonized screams, ebbing and flowing in a nightmarish melody. "What is that?" she cried, her voice trembling with dread. The man's eyes glinted with wicked glee. That's your new home," he said with a dark chuckle. "Welcome to hell." The realization crashed over her like a physical blow, and a scream tore from her throat. Her bare feet teetered on the edge before gravity claimed her, pulling her down into the fiery chasm. Her cries echoed briefly, then vanished as he pressed another button to seal the floor shut. "Ah, the sweet symphony of regret," he mused aloud, as if to himself. With a contented nod, he closed the folder on the table and stood, preparing for the next arrival. They never learned, did they? No matter. There was always more room in hell. This concludes the story. If you like it, then put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.